If you were looking for a job and had to give someone your resume, I would assume that you would be writing all the great qualities about you and why you should be hired for the job. But in today's lesson, we are going to be seeing God's resume, and it is amazing. And He gives us this resume to show us why He should be hired for the job of taking care of you and me. Join us today. All right, good morning. Welcome to our Psalm series. Glad you're joining us. I kind of want to just start off and talk about resumes today, because if you were actually looking for a job, you would have to turn in a resume, and on the resume it tells you all the good qualities, the jobs you had, why you are so awesome that you should be hired for that job. But today I want to talk about God's resume, because Psalm 33 actually does that. Because God's resume is amazing. Starting with this, everything is His. He owns everything. That's a pretty good way to start a resume. J. Vernon McGee said this is God's universe, and God does things His way. You may have a better way, but you don't have a universe. Okay? I love that. And how true that is. Like, we always like to do things our way, but God's way is so much better. He has a universe, all right? The day I realized that actually changed my life, and it changed my faith. Because I had never really thought about this before. But God not only created, but He controls. Like, think about that. Everything on this earth has a purpose. Even fleas, okay? In her book, The Hiding Place, Corrie ten Boom talks about an incident that taught her to be thankful for things that you and I would not normally be thankful for. And for her, it was fleas, all right? She and her sister Betsy, they were prisoners of the Nazis, had been transferred to the worst prison camp, Ravensbrück. Upon entering the barracks, it was completely overcrowded and infested with fleas. But they had a Bible that they had smuggled in. And they had this little Bible study. And in 1 Thessalonians, they were reading where it said, "Rejoice always, pray constantly, give thanks in all circumstances." So Betsy told Corrie to stop and thank the Lord for every detail of her new living quarters. And Corrie at first was like, "Yeah, I'm not doing that. This place is filled with fleas." But Corrie finally agreed to thank God for these pesky little creatures. But during the months spent at this camp, they were surprised to find that they could hold these Bible studies. They could hold prayer meetings in their barracks, and the guards never interfered, as if they never even knew what they were doing. And months later, they realized that the reason why the guards never came in there was because of the fleas. God made sure there were fleas so they could study the Bible together. And it was then that you go, wow, God is that big. He's even in control of the fleas. So when I read stories like that, God suddenly becomes very big in my life, which means I don't really have to worry about anything. I can trust Him for everything. I can trust Him to work, if something bad happens in my life, I can trust Him that He can work something good out of it. I can trust Him to lead me, to guide me. I can trust that everything He wrote in His Word, the Bible, is true from Him. Because this is what the Bible says. This is God's resume. I want you to watch this. Dr. Larry Penton writes this. This is number one of God's resume. He existed before anything else. Psalm 90 verse 2 says this: "Before the mountains were born, before you gave birth to the earth and the world, from eternity to eternity, you are God." Before anything was created, God was here. The second thing is this: He created all things. John 1:3 says, "All things were created through Him, and apart from Him, not one thing was created that has been created." That's a pretty good thing to have on a resume. I own everything. I created everything. I created you, okay? The third thing is that he sustains all things. If this were God's resume, he'd be like, well, I sustain all things too. I mean, think about all the galaxies, the planets, the stars, how the moon, they hang on nothing out there. God's like, I am sustaining everything to keep it going. Colossians 1:17 says, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. The fourth thing that would be on God's resume would be this: he is above all things. Isaiah 46:9 says, remember what happened long ago, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and no one is like me. I declare the end from the beginning, and from long ago what is not yet done, saying, my plan will take place, and I will do all my will. God is not limited or restrained by anything, because he is above everything. The fifth thing on his resume would be this: he knows all things. Nothing you or I do or say, he's not like, oh, I didn't know you were going to say that. Oh, I didn't know that's what you were thinking. No, God knows everything. Nothing is secret when it comes to him. Psalm 139:1 says, Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I stand up. You understand my thoughts from afar. You observe my travels and my rest. You are aware of all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know all about it, Lord. The sixth thing that is on his resume is this: he can do whatever he pleases. Psalm 135:6 says this: the Lord does whatever he pleases in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all the depths. Jeremiah 32:27 says, look, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me? See, as we're reading God's resume, what we're beginning to see is this is a powerful God. So if that's true, what are we afraid of in this life? We shouldn't be afraid of anything. We should want to get to know this God more and more and more. The seventh thing that would be on his resume was this: he orchestrates all things. All things. He orchestrated the job you got, the person you married, the child you had. Like, God orchestrates all things. There's such comfort in that. Isaiah 14:24 says this: the Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so it will be, as I have purposed, so it will happen. He orchestrates all things. That's good news. When something bad happens in your life, you can be like, God, I don't understand this, but I'm trusting you. If you orchestrate all things, I'm going to believe that you know what you're doing in this. There's something peaceful about that. Number 8 on his resume would be this: he rules over all things. In Daniel 4:34 and 35, the most powerful man on the earth at the time was Nebuchadnezzar. And he decides to take on God. But when God was through with him, here is what Nebuchadnezzar said. He said, but at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. Then I praised the Most High and honored and glorified him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? You can't do that. He rules over everything. And then the last one on his list would be this: he is in control of all things. Daniel 2:21 says this: he changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Rob and I were just talking about that this morning, because an election year is coming up next year, and then of course we had an election, and then that whole thing blew up. But it was just this reminder that God raises up presidents. Whether you like it or not, God's like, I'm behind that, and I have a purpose for it. So whoever is the elected official in our country today, God is raised up for a purpose. And we look around and go, what's happening to our country? But then on the other hand, you go, I don't know, God's doing something. And I know that, and I can be confident of that, because I know that God is in control of all things, even elections. And somehow that brings us peace. God is in control of all things, from the weather, the rain, the snow. to the presidents, like I said, to when someone is born, to when someone dies, to storms, and to here's a picture, and even volcanoes, okay? So when you really put that together, you say, wow, that's an impressive resume, and it is. And when I begin to recognize God for who He is, my faith skyrockets. So as I was reading through the Psalm, it reminded me of that. Because when I think of God, I see Him as all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-everything. And it makes me want to do what the psalmist in Psalm 33 did. This is what he writes. Sing joyfully to the Lord, you righteous. It is fitting for the upright to praise Him. Praise the Lord with the harp. Make music to Him on the 10-stringed lyre. Sing to Him a new song. Play skillfully and shout for joy. For the word of the Lord is right and true. He is faithful in all He does. And the Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of His unfailing love. See, it's easy to be thankful and grateful and sing joyfully to the Lord when we really understand who He is. When we walk outside and we see that what He's created, we see how powerful He is, it's easy to sing joyfully to Him. Verse 6, by the word of the Lord were what? The heavens made. Their starry host by the breath of His mouth. That was just nothing. And here you go. There's the stars. He gathers the waters of the sea into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the earth or world revere Him. For He spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of all people. And I think when we get that, when we really understand it, that God is working behind the scenes in Russia and China and Afghanistan and all of these places, in the United States and the governments and all of these things. He's saying, look, nothing can stop the plans of God. And when we really believe that, then we can relax. We don't have to worry because we know that God is in control. But we also don't have to worry like, well, what if we get invaded and we all die? Okay, well, we do. We better know Jesus. That's the point. But God says in His Word, He's given us all a number of days. Like nothing I do is going to stop the day that I'm supposed to die. It's not. And that's fine. I'm like, God, for as many days as you want me here, let me serve you. That's what I want. But sooner or later, we have to get to that point where we just trust Him. We trust what He's doing in this world. And there's something really, really comforting about that. Because it's true not only for just looking out and seeing the stars and the moon, but for everyday life. Let's say you didn't get that job. Let's say you didn't get into that school. Let's say the person broke off your engagement. Maybe you lost someone in a car accident. But by believing that God is really in control, we know He's that big. He could have stopped any of these things from happening. But as a follower of Jesus, if God has not stopped it, then He's doing something that we can't see at the moment. And what happens is we learn to trust Him with the bad. I remember reading about Jim Elliot, one of the missionaries murdered on the sandbar in Ecuador. He was one of the five. They were murdered by the very Indians that they were trying to share Jesus with. And the Indians threw their spears. And God could have saved them. God could have sent an angel to redirect the spear away from them. He could have turned the Indians' hearts to peace instead of murder. But God did not. He didn't. He let them die. But I think it's because God had a plan that was so much more far-reaching, that would save so many more people by letting these missionaries die. Because of this event, many of these Indians turned to Christ. The families of the slain missionaries, they actually went back and kept doing what their husbands died doing. And that was, let's come back and love on these people, even though they murdered our spouses. Okay? When the story got out, the mission field grew. Missionaries all over the world started in droves going to foreign countries. God was in control and He had a plan. Because nothing can thwart the plans of God. There is no attribute more comforting to his children than that of God's sovereignty. Under the most adverse circumstances, in the most severe trials, they believe that sovereignty has ordained their afflictions, that sovereignty overrules them, and that sovereignty will sanctify them all. There is nothing for which the children ought to more earnestly contend to than the doctrine of their master over all creation, the kingship of God over all the works of his own hands, the throne of God and his right to sit upon that throne, for it is God upon the throne whom we trust. When we get that, I honestly believe it will change your life and change your faith. C.S. Lewis says this: there is no neutral ground in the universe. Every square inch, every split second is claimed by God. They go on in verse 11 to say this: but the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. From heaven the Lord looks down and sees all mankind. From his dwelling place he watches all who live on earth. He who forms the hearts of all, who considers everything you do. Dr. Fred Penny shares this story. He said on his first trip to Ukraine, it was in the year 2000, he said, we visited Kiev and Lviv to connect with ministry training institutions. He said in 2002, he had his first teaching trip to Lviv to teach at their theological seminary. He said it was so rewarding to contribute to the work in the Ukraine, to meet students who had a passion for sharing the gospel there. But he said for the past 22 years, he'd made many, many more trips there and developed lifelong friendships. But in 2018, it seemed like it was time to actually move to the Ukraine and teach full time at this seminary. He said, we applied, but upon this formal application, we were told after we applied, we don't need you in the Ukraine. The door was closed. He said they were totally surprised. They were totally confused. They didn't know what God was doing. But then God opened another door in St. John's, Newfoundland, in the fall of 2018. He said the beloved place of my childhood had been 35 years since he lived in Newfoundland. Surprised? Yes. Confused? Maybe a little. He said now in the year 2022, because of the war in the Ukraine, Ukrainians are moving to St. John's. He said 2 former students of mine, now married with 3 children, accepted an invitation and moved into our home. They attend our church. Together, we have started a ministry to Ukrainian refugees, is what he says. He said it seems God's master plan was far superior to our modest plan. Surprised? Yes. Confused? Not so much anymore. Because that's what God does. What we go, I don't understand what you're doing, God. God actually does have a plan. And we just have to go with it and go along with it. We need to remember this. We have these plans of our own, like today I'm going to do this, and tomorrow I'm going to do this, and I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to go back to the Ukraine, and I'm planning on this. But look what James 4 says. He says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city. Spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Isn't that amazing? He's like saying, look, don't worry about it. I'm going to move you to where you need to be. Don't worry what you're going to do tomorrow. I will take care of it. Psalms 33:16 goes on to say this: no king is saved by the size of his army. No warrior escapes by his great strength. A horse is a vain hope for deliverance. Despite all its great strength, it cannot save. But the eyes of the Lord are on those who fear him, on those who hope is in his unfailing love, to deliver them from death and keep them alive in famine. He's saying so many people trust in their horses, their chariots, their money, their status, their wealth, whatever it is. And he's saying, yeah, you're not going to be saved by that in the long run. Several years ago, Jeff Stryker, he was a United States Army Ranger. He was posted in Mogadishu, Somalia. It'd be nice if I could say that right. For him, he said October 3rd and 4th, 1993, they were defining moments in his life. He said he was on one of the troops called to go into the center of Mogadishu, secure a building as part of a larger operation. This is all seen in a movie called Black Hawk Down. And it chronicled this, where Jeff Stryker, this whole time period for him. He said this: in the first trip into the city, he and most of his friends got out through a hailstorm of bullets. One man was shot and killed. It was then that he felt the fear. He began to pray. The Humvee was painted with blood as they escaped the city with their dead and wounded comrades. The news soon worsened. A helicopter was shot down. The team received orders to return to the melee. Yet his men understandably couldn't fight in the bloody Humvees. Stryker spent the next 30 to 45 minutes cleaning. No running water, only sponges and buckets. I began to talk to the Lord. I thought I was going to die, he said. Feeling his fear grow, he began to ask God to protect him, but his prayers soon changed. I'll never forget this for the rest of my life. A scene appeared in the landscape of my mind. The scene was Jesus in the garden. He clearly and honestly knew that he was going to die. He also showed that he did not want to go to that cross and die. And I knew that I didn't want to die that night. But Jesus courageously said, God, not my will, but yours be done. If I die tonight, that's fine, as long as your will is done, Stryker said. For the first time in his life, Stryker, who had been a Christian since age 13, was prepared to die. God spoke to my mind and my heart and said, I've been protecting you every day of your life. Stryker said, he did not tell me, you will live through the night. He simply showed me my life has always been in his hands. Isn't that beautiful? It's like that moment when you realize, all right, my life really is in his hands. Stryker and his men returned to the field of fire in Mogadishu that night and fought with a God-given courage. The sergeant first class would later be awarded the Bronze Star Medal V for valor. I fought differently that night than everyone else because of my faith, Stryker said. God had given him a supernatural peace in the midst of pandemonium. Further firefights and an ambush that nearly blew his Humvee off the road. I began to understand God's omnipotent power. Stryker said he was orchestrating every single bullet that was fired that night. The peace that I had was not only for my own life, but for the lives of my soldiers. If any of them were to get shot, then that was part of God's sovereign plan. And God chose to preserve Stryker that night. Someone wrote this: the destinies of the world are not, for instance, at the mercy of fleets and armies. The Lord reigns. To know that God rules, to realize his sovereignty, is to be delivered from fear and despair. Because we go on to verse 20 in this chapter, of Psalms. We wait in hope for the Lord. He is our help, our shield. In him our hearts rejoice, for we trust in his holy name. May your unfailing love rest upon us, O Lord, even as we put our hope in you. You may plan to go on a picnic on a certain day, but you don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to rain? Maybe you'll get sick. Maybe you'll get a flat tire. And many things in our life can happen as we're trying to accomplish something. But here's what we need to really grasp today, is that nothing can ever stop what God has determined. The weather can't stop God from doing what he needs to do because God controls the weather. Weakness can't stop God because God is all powerful. Lack of sufficient resources can't stop God because he has unlimited resources. God has no limitations and he controls all things. That is a really good resume. And when we get this, we let it sink into our souls, it will change your life. I know it because it changed mine. It will change your perspective on life. It will give you peace like you have never known before. If you are a follower of Jesus, you are a child of the Creator God of the universe. He has a plan, and you are part of that plan, and you can rest in that. Hope that helps you today. Have a really good day.